Hello there, and welcome to this third installment of hashtag Business of AFCON, collaboration between the Africa Football Business Show and the Africa Business of Sport podcast. As always, I have my two fellow co-hosts who have been with me throughout this fascinating series. First of all, the founder and CEO of the Football Foundation for Africa, Brian Wasala. Brian, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Jabu. Congratulations to the Bafana Bafana.
Thank you for that. Thank you for mentioning that, Brian. And my co-host on the Africa Business of Sport podcast, Adam Spio. Adam, how are you doing, sir?
Blessed and highly favored. Really looking forward to this conversation and to really disseminate all the information that we have there. And of course, also go Bafana Bafana. Now that Egypt is out, they are my team to win the competition.
Lovely. No, great to hear. So, as you just alluded to a bit there, Adam, today we're going to delve into a fascinating topic. And this is the intriguing intersection of international relations and football diplomacy, focusing specifically on the captivating stories that have emerged from the Africa Cup of Nations. So, as the tournament kicked off on the 13th of January, our attention was drawn to the fascinating phenomenon of stadium diplomacy employed by nation states such as China. The Alassane Ouattara Stadium in Abidjan, for example, serves as a prime example of China's strategic influence in Africa, where state-owned entities like the Beijing Institute of Architectural Design and the Beijing Construction Engineering Group play a crucial role. However, China isn't the only player in this game. Enter Saudi Arabia with its ambitious plan to position itself as an Afro-Eurasian hub of international football, from bidding for the 2034 World Cup to becoming the main sponsor of the African Football League. Saudi Arabia definitely has made significant strides. So on this episode today, we and a special guest that we are going to announce and introduce to you very soon, we're going to explore the motivations and the consequences behind these football diplomacy endeavors, questioning the implication for African nations and the global power dynamics at play. So let us unravel this complex web of economic, political, and strategic interests in football arenas within Africa. Brian, we have known for a very long time how intertwined sport and politics has been, not only in Africa, but all across the globe. But love to start off this episode by asking you, what is your position on nation states, whether that be from Africa or from around the world, and governments as well, being involved in sports? And what motivations do you think are at play there?
Jabu, I have to say, I think I'll quote one friend, Goran Eriksson. He once said that there's more politics in football than in politics itself. So I think football just lends itself to politics, and I don't think this is an issue. I think sometimes we tend to castigate this issue looking at it from a negative perspective. But if you look at the real definition of politics, what is politics? Politics is how people negotiate for resources. And sports is one area that needs resources to be invested in. So how do people in the sports sector, in the football sector, use politics to negotiate for resources? In this case, Africa finds itself in a position where people are really interested in the game, but beyond just the game, people are interested in Africa's natural resources. So how does the continent position itself so that it benefits from the geopolitical playground in this case? Because at the end of the day, there is no way we are able going to separate sports, football from politics. What I see is a few spheres of life: sports, politics, religion, that come together from time to time to interact. So how do we harness that for our progress? Hopefully to hear more about this in the show. Thank you, Jabu.
Adam, you were on CNN a couple of months ago and you spoke about the economic impact of AFCON being hosted in a certain host nation. And one of the main points that you put out there was around stadium development. Now, from my perspective, watching that, I thought that you meant stadium development in the sense that local individuals from Ivory Coast would be the ones going and building those stadiums. So when you now hear of news and reports which are absolutely true about, for example, the Chinese state and Chinese state-owned companies coming in to build some of these stadiums, not only for Ivory Coast AFCON, but reaching all the way back to the Gabon and Equatorial Guinea AFCON in 2012, as well as the 2015 AFCON, which was also in Gabon, where the Chinese state has a huge role in building the stadiums. What is your position on that, and what implication does that have on the economic impact ultimately if we're not having the employment go to people on the ground, but rather from outside companies?
It's always important to look at it from two lenses. The first lens, which majority of people tend to focus on, is the lens where they would say that would rather give big contracts for development to externals because of the mentality towards how they'll get the job done, and the mentality towards how it can even develop more bilateral agreements for other initiatives beyond even the immediate project. But the truth of the reality is that more often than not, we see that the end products of these infrastructure, whether it's stadia, it's training sites, it is conference sites and whatnot, the end product is of a high quality. They do a really good job. And you'd want to spend your money on people and entities that when you come to them and say, I need A, B, C, and D done, they will get it done and get it done with the highest quality. So what is important for here Africa is that brands on the continent that are into the same industry, whether for you it is in construction or it is in procurement, you should be able to take the lessons learned by these external brands, somewhat copy what they have and add your own unique factor to make you very, let's say, competitive in the market. So off the top of my head, let's say with the 6 stadia that have been built or made ready for this AFCON, one of them, a local contractor, maybe contributed to 15% of the development of that stadia. If now they're able to look at what was done with their Chinese or their international counterparts and learn from how they do things, for instance, or perhaps for the next competition that will be held there, whether it's football related or any other sport, they can come in and say, we've learned from these guys, we've upgraded our services and our products, and we believe that we can be well placed to take on such projects moving forward. So it's important to appreciate the external help that comes through, but African brands need to learn from the external guys with what they're doing, because we can't argue for the fact that they have been doing it for a very long time, and they'll probably continue to do it if the African brands do not step up their game. That is how I see things, from a development point of view moving forward. We can't say we're going to stop partnership with these external brands. We need them because there are times where they also benefit from us. But African brands, like I'll say again, need to make sure you learn from your international counterparts and make yourself much more what's the word I'm looking for? Much more lucrative moving forward for subsequent projects to come.
Brian, what's your opinion on the varying perspectives when we speak about, for example, the Chinese state coming into Africa and building a stadium where, for example, there's an agreement. If we build you a stadium, then we enter a strategic economic agreement where you export this and that. Why do you think that there is this negative perspective when it comes to states being involved in African football in particular?
I think it's what you mentioned here. It always feels like it's a manipulative or a one-sided agreement where in this case the Chinese they dictate, and the stadium here is just a carrot. What they are looking for actually is to control the economy of our countries in this case, and destabilize the balance of trade. If you look at, for example, a lot of these relationships that we have in stadium diplomacy, where the Chinese have come in and put up infrastructure for Africa. It was in Ghana, it was in Gabon, in Cameroon, and now in Ivory Coast. It's immediately linked to exploration of crude oil. So this is what is kind of signed underneath, which may look exploitative for the continent. But in my opinion, in my view, this is just where we are as a continent or as a global geopolitical. Africa is still weak economically, politically. So we go into these arrangements from a weak position, and therefore the Chinese or whoever else is coming from outside will always be seen to have an upper hand. Another thing is that these deals have also been linked to individuals who kind of get into these arrangements with the Chinese for almost like their personal gains, but at the expense of the long-term economic gains of the continent, the long-term strengthening of Africa's or the country's economic position. So those are the criticisms. But look at from the other side, as Edem also points out, it's up to us to use this arrangement to see where do we strengthen, how do we learn, how do we make these a platform where we are now gaining knowledge, so that in future we have a strategy where we become self-sustainable. Can we get some of the technology that they're using so that we're able to develop our own stadiums going forward? And this also kind of makes me think about the size of some of these stadiums that they construct, and also the style which they are constructed. Some of them do not have that African touch. Though in Ivory Coast, I see it's really been done well. But historically, they've just been more like a template that is used across the continent to build these stadiums. So these are things that we should learn from, so that as we go forward, we strengthen our position within these agreements, and we see how we can become self-sustaining going forward, Jab.
Adam, in this geopolitical arena that has been built out in Africa, we don't only have China, and I think most of the attention is on China given their influence and their role in the current AFCON. But there is another player, and that's a player that we've been speaking about on the podcast for a very, very long time, Saudi Arabia. They are emerging rather as a strategic rival to China when it comes to sports diplomacy within Africa. And they've done that by signing a whole lot of MOUs and going into agreements with different football associations, not least CAF, where they signed a historic MOU that has now covered competitions. And we know that Visit Saudi, for example, is the main sponsor of the African Football League. How would you assess the introduction that Saudi Arabia has had when it comes to football diplomacy within Africa in particular?
For me, one thing I'm very excited about is the fact that it's now happening now, where the buzz and the growth of sports business really and truly is becoming an important thing for Africa. For a very long time, we've not really taken our sports business very seriously. And of course, we know that in Europe and in America, some of the very best sports brands are there because of the culture of sports business and the environment of sports business within those regions. And here we're seeing here in Africa that we're gradually changing that narrative. We're gradually becoming a hotbed for sports business conversations. Perhaps it should have come a bit earlier. Maybe then would have seen a bit more growth, but it's never too late. I'm very excited that they're going on the counter attack to really want to create change. You know, the World Cup, where it's going to come through for us here in Africa for the very second time through Morocco, and the positioning that they are going to have in making it a reality for Africans. This is the best, situation that we've experienced for a very long time. Unfortunately for us, European brands didn't do it when we were becoming very big within the European space for our superstars. But now that the Saudi brands are doing it, we're seeing more African players finding Saudi as a lucrative league and a home for them to go to employ their trade. So it's only going to be a continued win-win situation here for us. Another increased benefit for us is that the audience for our games, our competition will increase. We know that the Middle East is one of the biggest followers of European football and national team football. We have the opportunity here to really take advantage of our partnership with Saudi brands to not only grow our local leagues, but to give more eyeballs to the kind of excellence that we have through our women's AFCON, our men's AFCON, and the other competitions that we have on the continent.
Just to double down on what you've just mentioned, Adam, around players in particular who have now went to Saudi and the indirect impacts that Saudi Arabia is having on football, because we heard of the lovely, heartwarming story of Sadio Mane building a stadium for his own community. And it happens that he's on a £600,000 contract in Saudi Arabia now. So you can see the indirect impacts that are happening when it comes to Saudi Arabia and football. Alrighty, let us move on to the second segment of our conversation, and we are going to introduce a leading academic when it comes to the geopolitical economy of sports, everything that has to do with politics, international relations, and the sports that we love so much. It's an honor and privilege to have on the business of AFCON, Professor of Sports and Geopolitical Economy at SKEMA Business School in Paris, Professor Simon Chadwick. Prof, welcome on to the hashtag Business of AFCON. Great to have you here.
Again, this is not my first time, so thanks for inviting me back. I must have done an okay job first time.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here, Prof. I mean, let's go straight into it. We read many of your articles covering the fascinating stories when it comes to geopolitics and African football. And let us start with China, because that is the main perspective in which we enter this conversation. Could you elaborate on this concept of stadium diplomacy and how it fits into China's broader Belt and Road Initiative, particularly in context of the AFCONs that took place in Gabon and the one currently taking place in Ivory Coast?
Before I answer that, I think it's really important to stress that somehow we're saying this is China or Saudi Arabia. What we know historically, and let's talk about the British Empire straight away, is the way in which the British Empire used sport for a variety of different purposes across various territories. What we're seeing is, if not the same thing, then certainly something that is very similar to. So this is not just all about China. It's about other countries as well. But I guess fundamentally, China's an interesting country. What we know is over the last 30 years, it has reached stunning levels of economic growth, sometimes double-digit economic growth. this is really important domestically, because essentially what it does is it brings stability. Because if people are living well, if they're prospering, then you're less likely to question the government. And obviously China has an autocratic government, it's unelected. But of course, to sustain that kind of economic performance, you need resources, and most notably, you need raw materials. We know that manufacturing in China is strong and diverse. They're making all kinds of things, from phone batteries to steel, to computer screens, all kinds of things. And where do we find the resources that they need? Well, those resources are in Africa. I guess at this point we need to say it's not just all about football and stadiums either, because I'm sure a lot of people who are watching this now will know about the Belt and Road Initiative, and they will realize that China has been very active now in Africa for a decade or more, engaged in bilateral trade. And so essentially what China is doing, and if we come back specifically to stadiums, is we'll build you a stadium in return for my first degree was economics, and year one, day one, lecture one, we were told there's no such thing as a free lunch. And I think in this particular case, it's not a case of China saying, "Oh, we'll buy you raw materials," because what they're trying to do is to use stadiums and stadium diplomacy as a means through which to access those resources, but also to access those resources on an ongoing basis, but also as a result of that, because essentially that's creating an interdependence. And what we know is when there are interdependencies involved, there is power involved. And what I think China is trying to do, and this is not meant to be a criticism of China specifically or anyone, but China is trying to accumulate power in Africa and to influence the decisions that are made across the continent.
I'll shoot straight up. So how does Africa and African countries make sure that they get a good deal from these outpouring of Chinese diplomacy, and by extension other countries that are interested in the continent?
That's a really interesting question, Brian. And I think just to link it to the previous question, is there are essentially two ways this happens. So the first way is the gifting of venues. So in other words, here it is, we'll build it for you, we'll design it for you, but we'll build it for you, it's yours. But inevitably that is very often linked to trade relationships, bilateral trade relationships. And I've listened to you talking about Gabon. Gabon was a great example, because at the time that it was announced that China would build stadiums for Gabon, the late President Bongo was actually in Beijing signing a major trade deal. So Gabon became an elevated trade partner of China. So there is that kind of bilateralism involving trade in the gifting of stadiums. But the second way in which this happens is through the provision of soft loans. And soft loans are loans provided by China at significantly below market rates of interest. And this is particularly interesting because this is a strategy that is used by China across the world. And certainly in, for example, Sri Lanka, we've seen instances of countries and governments that have borrowed money from China and then have defaulted on their repayments back to China. And as a consequence of that, China has taken possession of the asset, even though it's in Sri Lanka. And I think this is something that Africa has to be mindful of. But looking at this positively, what Africa gets and African countries get from China is obviously stadium infrastructure that can be utilized across a period of years, but also stability in trade relationships that perhaps that African nations don't get from elsewhere. The downside is, of course, China may seek to exert its power. We've talked already. Certainly in constructing stadiums, it seems to be that the high quality employment that is created by stadium constructions attracts Chinese employees. The much lower quality, unskilled work, very often laborers. Yes, that is local workers who would do that, but of course the significance of the legacy is much less pronounced. So I guess the conclusion to make is obviously there's a choice for African nations to make. It's a mixed picture. There are good things. There are good reasons to work with China, but equally there are problems and issues as well.
Prof, my question to you is, in noticing, like you just said perfectly, that African nations would have to make a decision at one point in time, I'm asking, is there a ceiling where Africa can get so much development from China where we can reach a point and we say that, you know what, for everything that we potentially need, you've already provided for us, and we have now developed our capability to handle those things that you've built for us. So we don't necessarily need you anymore. I ask this particularly with sports because we see that some of the very best world events barely happen in Africa. If it's not the AFCON, you would not have the Olympics coming here, you would not have the World Cup coming here regularly, you will not have the Women's World Cup coming here regularly, and other top events as such. I mean, there's still no top Grand Slam coming from Africa, although we do have places that you can, build a high quality tennis facility. So is there a ceiling where we can get and say, you know what, we're done and we're going to move forward with the developments for ourselves? So yeah, it's like, let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, if at first China was a 9.5 with regards to relevance, it reduces to maybe a 4.5 to regards to relevance now.
I think you're probably talking to the wrong European, because for me, I think Africa, in this moment, Africa is in an amazing place, and I get a growing sense of there could be genuine change across the continent over the next decade, and so this requires African nations to take control much more of their own destinies and to be efficient and effective and to make good decisions and demonstrate good leadership. So, there are some challenges for you, but, your time is now. We know that economic growth rates across the continent are much more robust than we see, for example, in Europe and North America. And so there is some potential there for, I think, industry in general, but particularly the sport industry and the football industry in particular to develop and grow. But at the same time, and it's interesting, again, I listened to your talk, globalization and international trade, we're all part of this. This is not unique to Africa. We're all part of this. But I think, I'm really interested to see Africa begin to shape its relationships with the rest of the world rather than simply being recipients of the, if you like, of the altruism of others. And this brings me to China, because I speak to people from across Africa on a regular basis, and opinion seems to be divided. And one school of thought is, well, the Chinese are doing a lot more for us than you ever did. They're doing a lot more for us than Europe and North America are doing right now. So why shouldn't we work with them? And certainly, if you listen to what the Chinese government and government departments will say, they will say, well, we're doing this as a bilateral partnership. We're not seeking to exploit. We're not seeking to exert power. It's an example of bilateralism. But the other school of thought, of course, is that somehow this is a form of neocolonialism, and that effectively what African nations are doing is they're essentially selling themselves into an asymmetric relationship with China, where China's got lots of power and the African nation's got relatively little power, and therefore China gets what it wants without Africa getting what it wants. So as I say, I think I come back to choices, and I know there are constraints, and I know there are issues, I know there are challenges, obstacles to address, but I do think that Africa is in a really interesting position right now, and it does need to take control of its own destiny.
Prof, Saudi Arabia seems to be emerging as a strategic rival to China in the realm of football diplomacy in Africa. So our question here is, how does Saudi Arabia's approach differ from China's, and what potential economic and geopolitical implications might arise from Saudi's increasing involvement in African football and sports in general?
So again, if I tie it to the last question and go back into the webinar initially, what do they want from you? They do want oil. and they want gas, but they also want lithium, and they want cobalt, they want manganese. I'm in Europe right now. I'm in Britain right now. We don't have it. You've got it. We don't. So with digital, the emergence of digital technologies and mobile phones, and then obviously electric cars, and there will be other forms of technology that require those raw materials. This is why I think we're now seeing a very interesting pivot from global north to global south. And that's why I make this statement about Africa is in a really interesting position right now. Now, this is not just a China story, it's a Saudi Arabia story as well. So, let me give you an example. So Saudi Arabia wants to become the world's leading processor of lithium. And right now in Zimbabwe, for any listeners who are from Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe is being called Lithium Valley because Zimbabwe has lots of lithium. And we're already beginning to see Saudi Arabian investors investing generally in Zimbabwe's lithium industry. Now, again, this is going to throw the ball up to Zimbabwe government. What are you going to do about this? How are you going to manage it? How are you going to make sure the whole country benefits? How are you going to make sure that Saudi Arabia doesn't dominate and that it's a symmetric power relationship? But what I think is really significant about all of this is that Saudi Arabia, we are seeing, not just in Zimbabwe, but in other countries too. Mauritania is another example, is investing in sport, investing in football, in a similar kind of sport diplomacy. Now, what's really interesting is if you go back to this time last year when the stories first emerged that Saudi Arabia wanted to bid for the 2030 World Cup. And the initial play was it would be an Afro-Eurasian World Cup. So it would be Egypt, Greece, and Saudi Arabia. And there were even reports that Saudi Arabia had offered to build the infrastructure for Egypt and Greece to host the tournament. And so we are seeing that Saudi Arabia, in its quest to be certainly an Asian power, but maybe an Afro-Eurasian power in the same way as China, is already spilling over into football. And I guess the kind of crucial detail of this is just across the Red Sea. Saudi Arabia looks at Africa, and so the Red Sea, what happens in the Red Sea, what's happening in the Gulf region and the Middle East more generally right now, the investments that Saudi Arabia is making in football, the relationships that Saudi Arabia wants to have with the African Football League, for example. All of these things are connected. And this is very much about Saudi Arabia making its play and trying to create the same kind of bilateral relations as China has done.
How is Europe responding to all this shift towards the Middle East now, and specifically Saudi Arabia? And since this is all connected, then how does this change the relationship that we have traditionally had with Europe when it comes to football and sports in general?
Anthony Blinken was at the African Cup of Nations. Can you believe it? Who would have imagined that a senior American politician would go to Ivory Coast to watch a football game? Maybe I should be calling it a soccer game. I don't know. But went to Ivory Coast to watch a football game. This is like unheard of, right? What's really interesting is the Chinese foreign minister was also in Ivory Coast to watch some football as well. So I think it tells us how important football is, how important Ivory Coast is at this moment, but how important Africa is more generally, because as we know, we live in a really complex, really turbulent world. All of those old certain things that we knew back in the 20th century, they're gradually eroding, and we are seeing different countries from around the world ascending in their power, partly because they've got resources. For example, we mentioned African nations already. And so I think that what we are seeing generally across the world is sport being used for soft power purposes, sport being used for diplomacy, sport being used to nation brand. Sport being used to sport wash, if we want to use that term, to manage. I prefer to talk about managing image and reputation. But if you think about if you think about sport, if you think about football, think about English Premier League in terms of nation branding, Premier League in England. You think about sports administration, immediately Switzerland. And what I think is really interesting in Africa is there are opportunities in Africa, for the biggest and best football league, the most commercial football league, the administrative hub of African football, and so on and so forth. So I think what Africa shouldn't do, it shouldn't be afraid of this. It shouldn't run shy of this. The time has come. You got to step up. And so we really need to see some really interesting football brands in Africa. We need to see some really interesting examples of good practice in the governance of African football. Fantastic events being staged, maybe in Morocco 2030, for example. So it's over to you guys. You're the next generation of leaders and managers. So there's a lot of a big onus of responsibility on you.
Hopefully our generation and those who come after us will really just take the good things of the geopolitical nature of sports and, move it forward to develop things. You mentioned ethics and running things very well from a governance point of view. Perhaps maybe a partnership or a relationship, a solid relationship with Saudi can enable us to really train our administrators to become a bit more ethical in their dealings. So that can be a soft benefit that isn't seen as a physical or a quantitative return on investment. I particularly would really like to see a situation where here in African sport, all our administrators, our leaders, our presidents, CEOs are really doing things from a very ethical point of view, where we can see that if it's money coming through, the money is being allocated for all these things and it's done the way. And if it's like resources coming through, it's being used for the right things. At the end of the day, it's the incoming athletes that will benefit if things are done well.
So I didn't kind of answer the last question properly. If you look at Africa's last 100 years, we know how that was. We know what it involved. We know that Africa didn't develop in the way that it probably should have done. And here we are now in the 21st century, where the world is being turned upside down. So there is a pivot from global north to global south. And what it seems to me, at least as a European, is you're getting countries and their governments like Saudi Arabia coming to you and saying, well, work with us, and let's do things in a different way. And let's try and be more bilateral in the way we go about our business. That takes me back to a point I made about symmetric power and asymmetric power. And what you've got to make sure as a continent is that it is symmetric power, so that Saudi Arabia is not exploiting you and China is not exploiting you, that it is truly egalitarian and bilateral. So you give a little, they give a little, and you move forward on that basis. But certainly, if we're thinking about Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia is making you an offer that nobody else is going to make you. Certainly not Europe or the United States is going to make you right now. And so obviously a decision, geopolitically, you have to make that decision about, do you shift some of your alliances, your historic alliances, away from the United States, away from Britain, away from other centers of power, towards these new centers of power that we're seeing emerging countries like China and Saudi Arabia.
And that is the end of this second installment of the hashtag Business of AFCON, delving into the geopolitics, international relations, China's role in this AFCON, what we think of Saudi Arabia and what they're doing in African football, with none other than Professor Simon Chadwick. Prof, it's been a fascinating episode, very eye-opening. Thank you for coming on, and hopefully we'll have you back very soon.
Thank you for inviting me. As always, I always love talking about particularly football in Africa in general, but particularly football in Africa.
Love that. Please do follow the Football Foundation for Africa on Twitter. They are at FF Africa. On LinkedIn, you can find them at Football Foundation for Africa. Africa Business of Sport podcast. You can find us on X at Africa BSP. On Instagram at Africa Business of Sport, and on LinkedIn at the Africa Business of Sport podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on this third installment of the hashtag Business of AFCON, and we hope to see you again next week very soon. Cheers for now. We're now moving. We're now moving on to our Q&A session. So the next couple of minutes, we'll have an opportunity to ask Professor Simon Chadwick a question. So please do ready your questions. I'll just go back and read some of the comments that have been coming in. Prof Nandi speaks about Turkey. He says, let's not lose sight of Turkey. It goes far beyond China. Any comments? Cameroon, Rwanda, and Senegal are classic examples of Turkey's Suma construction company's influence in Africa. What are your thoughts on that, Prof?
So, yeah, the important thing to keep in mind is that 70% of the world's population lives on the Afro-Eurasian landmass. Wow. So, this is we are important. You are important. I'm important. We are important. And so, what you keep in mind, if you can see this on a map, at the center of this map is Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and so inevitably, geographically and geopolitically, Turkey is going to reach into Africa just as China has, just as Saudi Arabia has. Specifically on Rwanda, keep in mind that the one country that is investing heavily into Rwanda is Qatar. So Qatar is trying to buy Rwandan Airways or Air Rwanda. Qatar is seeking to be the major funder of Kigali's new international airport. And as a result of that, what we're going to see, for example, is sponsorships. We will see perhaps even competitions, games, tournaments being played in Rwanda in conjunction with Qatar Airways, keeping in mind that Qatar Airways is also a sponsor of the FIFA World Cup. So look at a map and try to envision that map with Turkey in it, but then try to think of a network and the relationships between Qatar and Qatar Airways and Rwanda and all of these other entities. There is a battle taking place. So, Turkey, Qatar, China, Saudi Arabia, Europe's not dead yet. There are some European countries that want to increase their influence in Africa. But of course, the crucial detail for us as a group of people is that many of them want to put football at the forefront of this.
Another comment mentions how Nigeria will lead sports diplomacy in the near future. That's very interesting. Prof, how does an African nation, we know that China, Saudi Arabia, and external nations might want to pursue sports diplomacy within the continent, but is it possible for an African country itself to be able to increase its influence through sport within the continent too?
I've not got it in front of me, but finally, last week, I managed to buy 2018 Nigeria World Cup shirt. So I've been trying to buy this now for 6 years, and finally, it was brand new. I bought it. Now you might be thinking, well, why did you do? Why did you do this, and why did you wait so long? Well, it's taken me so long because when the Nigeria shirt was released in 2018, there was a queue of people, of 3,000 people, and they sold out their entire stock in London in 3 hours. And this was nominated for a design prize because I think if for those of you who remember that Nigeria World Cup shirt from 2018, I thought the design and the style at that particular point in time captured the zeitgeist. When I look at that shirt, it is so 2018. It is unbelievable. So why am I saying this? Well, just using one example, Nigeria's got soft power. And for me, that World Cup shirt was a great example of soft power. I think Mohamed Salah in Egypt is soft power. One of the things that's amazing, I never expected to be saying these words, but Cape Verde, who would have imagined? So in Europe right now, the number of news outlets that are talking about the country and talking about the players and talking about diasporas. So what I see in Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, many other countries, is you have the raw materials, and what you need is you need the confidence and the self-belief to build on your soft power assets and make the most of those soft power assets. I mean, I guess Nigeria is a great example because you got Nollywood, you got the film industry, and you got the Super Eagles, and all of that. Nigerian business people, you've got all of that. But Nigeria isn't alone. There are other countries in Africa who've got those raw materials as well.
I think a follow-up to that is sometimes, you say Nigeria in this case of the Jersey has the soft power. How do you translate these quickly into economic gains? And I'm asking a question that I probably already have an answer, because one of the beautiful things I've seen in this year's AFCON is the brand that, the technical brand that is supporting Cape Verde tempo. Because if you look at the Nigeria's influence, they have a huge population. The brand is there, and it's a good design of the jersey. It can sell, but at the end of it all, it's Nike that's going to reap the economic gains. So how does Africa quickly switch from projecting this soft power to actually benefiting economically from our resources?
And when you say Nike, keep in mind that England, where I'm from, and France, where I work, their shirts are also Nike as well. Yeah. So unfortunately, we still live in a world where American organizations have quite a lot of influence. But I do get your point, Brian. Absolutely, I get your point. You've got to. So for those who are perhaps unfamiliar with soft power is attractive power. So it's a way of attracting others and convincing these other people that you are trustworthy and legitimate, and you want the same things as they do. And so what I think African nations need to do is they need to know the basis upon which they are going to attract others, the kind of messages that they can communicate, the kind of values that they can encapsulate. And that needs to be managed. Absolutely, it needs to be managed. So this is not going to happen by chance. There needs to be a political commitment domestically within countries to actually achieve this. But I like your question, Brian, because in 2018, the British government sent a trade delegation to Doha, essentially to try and pitch for business at the 2022 World Cup. Actually, 2017 it was. And interestingly, they sent a Premier League club. It was Tottenham Hotspur. They sent senior managers from Tottenham Hotspur as part of this trade delegation. Because if you're British, if you're the British government, we know that across the world, people inevitably, wow, you've brought people from Tottenham Hotspur. We want to be there. We want to talk to them. We want to engage with this. And so, there are various ways of doing this. But I think the crucial detail, or the kind of punchline to all of this is about self-interest. So this is not about Nigeria saying, well, we really want to help the Brazilians, or we really want to help the Chinese, or we really want to help the Indians. This is about Nigerian national self-interest. And I don't think there's anything embarrassing about that, anything unusual about that. That's the game that other countries across the world are playing. And you've got to learn to play it. And as you rightly point out, Brian, crucially, this is about promoting domestic industry. So Nigerians are wearing Nigerian brand shirts, and the same in South Africa and wherever else. And so soft power alone is not going to do it for you. Soft power needs to sit within a more holistic football strategy, sports strategy, industrial strategy.
Cool. Thank you for that, Prof. I just have one question from one of my colleagues, Olivier Jaros. He prefers to ask it on WhatsApp, and it's linked to the shift from Europe to the East, to the Middle East, when it comes to football. But then he asks, the question is, if Africa can become the neutral point of convergence between powers, and what role can sports play in this, football play in this?
Now, perhaps somewhat ironically, I think Saudi Arabia wants to be seen as being the neutral center of a new world power order. And so this is why Saudi Arabia is rapidly trying to reinvent itself as a, you know, as a nice country where bad things don't happen, because of course we many of us have got particular associations with Saudi Arabia. So, you know, this is a competitive process. Absolutely, it's a competitive process. And we go back to Namdi again, and hi Namdi, to my old friend. You know, Turkey is part of this as well. And as we've seen, Blinken at the African Cup of Nations, the United States is not going to give up. United Arab Emirates is investing very, very heavily in various ways in the eastern part of Africa. So what I think Africa and African nations need to do is not get left behind by the strength or the power or the fortitude of other nations. But, you know, at the same time, you potentially do have this geopolitical positioning as being a neutral, how can we put this, a neutral node in a network that links east and west, for example. You know, certainly we know that relations between China and the United States are not especially good right now. Africa could play a role in that as the kind of the neutral center of this power network.
Super.
And that is the end of our Q&A session. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the #Business of AFCON with the incredible Professor Simon Chadwick. Thank you for staying on and answering some of our questions, Prof. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, as always, for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who's here today and asking questions. And keep the faith and do good work. And let's see what happens up to 2030, because obviously 2030, I know it's Morocco, and I know Morocco is a long way from Morocco to South Africa, but even so, you know, Africa is getting another opportunity, and that's really, really important.
Couldn't have said it better. Good night. Thank you so much for joining this episode of the #Business of AFCON, a collaboration between the Football Foundation for Africa and the Africa Business of Sport podcast. Goodbye.
Thank you.